argue before you guys today. On the outset, we'd like to clarify that this debate is not about one human being using an act of violence against another human being, but this human being acting in furtherance of goals of a sovereign, therefore reducing her culpability. And this is the burden we take upon ourselves today to show you that this culpability can necessarily be reduced, right? So let me tell you the 5 things I'm going to be talking about here today. First, the idea of a mitigating factor in the criminal justice system. Second, the hierarchical nature of war in the first place. Third, who conducts war crime trials. Fourth, the purpose of these war crime trials. And fifth, the message, the normative idea sent to the international community. On the idea of a normative factor. Mr. Speaker, we think that a mitigating factor is essentially something that reduces culpability when the mens rea or the intent of that crime cannot be solely attributed to the particular actor, right? We think that when someone goes out and rapes someone next to them, the mens rea is solely attributable to that actor in the first place, right? However, in the paradigm of a war crime trial or in the paradigm of war in general, because exceptions are made in the international legal community for war crimes, the nature is that when I commit an act which is a war crime, I am doing this in furtherance of certain goals and certain orders given by that sovereign, right? Hence, my mens rea is not one to actually go and murder a person, but is to further the interest of the sovereign that I am bound by, right? Therefore, we think that while there is a knowledge involved in killing a person or using grievous hurt against a person in the paradigm of war, this knowledge is necessarily diluted because there is no intention which can be attributed to normative things in a normal criminal domestic justice system, right? So we therefore think that the idea that mens rea is diluted because there is a command of the sovereign is really, really important, right? We also think that in a large cases of war crimes, there have been, for example, in the Nuremberg trials, cases of severe brainwashing, right? Like the guy saying that I did do this and I was in fact brainwashed into doing this and I didn't know whether I had the intent to do this or not, right? We think that this is really, really important because you can only hold someone directly and entirely culpable for something they intended to do, right? We also think that it's really important that we will hold this person culpable, but only the sentence will be mitigated, right? Which is the burden we have to show you today. And it's really, really important to say that we still think that the person has acted in knowledge that he or she is committing something which is a wrong act, but deserves a mitigating sentence because of the fact that they're acting in furtherance of the sovereign. But let's look at the principle of this debate. The hierarchical nature of war in the first place. When you're acting in furtherance of national goals, there's a hierarchy that you function within as a soldier, as a colonel, as the head officer, right? And these things are equally attributable to the head officer giving a command as it is to the soldier actually committing that act in the first place, right? We think you can only punish a citizen when they're aware that something is normatively wrong and the legal paradigm within that country tells you that something is normatively wrong. This soldier has been raised in a paradigm where his country tells him what is right and what is wrong, right? In furtherance of this idea of right and wrong, he commits this act of grievous hurt in war crime trials. He doesn't think it's wrong because his country endorses this act, tells him that he will become a martyr if he actually does this act and supports this act, right? So in his paradigm of what is right and what is wrong, this is in fact in furtherance of that, and therefore he cannot be held entirely, directly and tangibly culpable, right? We believe that when sovereign authorities act, they have the power within a framework to influence people in ways that individuals don't have, right? We also think that this is different from causing grave hurt to your neighbor because of all of the things we told you about, and the fact that in the international community there exist things like rules of engagement which allow people to know exactly what the sovereign actually commands, right? So we will ensure that there has been an order given to this person within the paradigm of burden of proof of these war crime trials to ensure that the person has been given an order and has been acting in furtherance of that order, right? Third, we'd like to talk to you about who conducts war crime trials in the first place. The paradigm of war crime trials is necessarily that the winner conducts these war crime trials, right? In the Nuremberg trials, it's the Allied powers that conduct the war crime trials, and therefore, we tell you, Mr. Speaker, this is really, really important to understand that the idea of justice is already diluted in favor of the winner, right? The winner already says what they think is a normative idea of what is right or over what is wrong, right? So we think that in this context, the winner also has an incentive to be more balanced and give an image to the international community that we recognize you did something wrong, but we also recognize something else. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about. What does this move do? Taking away entire culpability from the person itself tackles and addresses the larger ideology that the country espouses. We think that wars are about this larger ideology. We think think that the wars are about the Nazi ideology in Germany and not about the dude who was given a gun by Hitler and who's shooting that person, right? While he was culpable and he understands that he's a human being causing hurt to another, the ideology of war, the fact that this ideology propagates, incentivizes people to take part in war, is the target of war crime trials, right? The moment you target these war crime trials is the actual purpose of justice in the first place, and this is going to reduce war because you're tackling the ideology and not an individual person in the first place, right? POIs. Okay. Yeah.
Even war generals have been...
Okay, sit down. We don't think that the point about generals giving orders to someone else is within this, because what we believe on this side of the house is that when a general is giving orders to someone else, it's not that we are prosecuting the general individually in the present case, right? We're just saying that the culpability of the actor who is the soldier is reduced tangibly on this side of the house because he is doing this in furtherance of this ideology. If the general is also given a command from a larger sovereign authority, then that paradigm holds as well, right? But on the nature or the purpose of war crime trials, why are war trials different from any domestic criminal justice system and the purposes that these justice systems espouse? The only purpose of having a war crime trial and having this paradigm is to give closure to the victim state, right? To say that something wrong happened and we as the international community want to acknowledge this. We think that that's really, really important. If the only thing is to give closure to an entire state, right? The Allies think that Germany did something really, really bad. The culpability and the closure to the victim is not associated by that single Nazi guy who's probably pushing someone else or using that gun, right? It's associated with the idea that people can be massacred in concentration camps using gas chambers, and it's that ideology that needs to be tackled, right? So we don't think that reducing the culpability when already the idea of justice is diluted in favor of the winner does any harm, and in fact does tangible benefits because it targets the root of war and the purpose of war crime trials in itself, right? We believe victims get closure better on our side of the house, right? But for the international community and the winner itself, we believe that in the international framework that we live in today, Mr. Speaker, what happens is the winner is a country that has won the war and has a responsibility to make sure that the war crime trial is conducted in a manner that is fair, and this is in the interest of the winner itself, to look like a country that is balanced, fair within the international community and recognizes that these ideologies actually treat people as little rats within a larger sovereign paradigm. We think that the moment you do this, it benefits the winner, it benefits the international community, because there is recognition that culpability cannot be directly attributed to this guy who is in fact within the command of the larger sovereign. Because culpability cannot be directly attributed because of the nature of the sovereign, we're extremely proud to be on side opening government.
Who's chair? Mr. Speaker, when a soldier rapes civilian women with impunity, tortures innocents in the most gruesome manner possible, or kills little children, we think these are crimes by individuals against individuals, and characterizing them as anything else is a disservice to humanity as a whole. The problem we have with side opening government's case is that most of their arguments are arguments against prosecuting anyone for war crimes, including generals. Because when we talk to you about brainwashed soldiers who have been raised to believe that their cause is just, we tell you the same defense is equally applicable to war generals who in most scenarios do believe that what they are pursuing is a just cause in the interests of their nations. When they talk to you about the Nuremberg trials being conducted by the Allies who are the victors and how the narrative is necessarily skewed, we don't see why there's then a necessity to draw any distinction between war generals and the soldiers under them, right? I'll now move on to my constructive arguments and work in my subsequent rebuttals. I'm first going to talk to you about why there's a reason that the principle of agency cannot be allowed to outsource criminal liability, especially in the context of war crimes. I'll then talk to you about how there's an equal ability of gaining information in the context of these crimes, both for the generals and for the soldiers. I'm then going to talk to you about how soldiers themselves do stand to benefit from the actions that they are committing, and finally deal with this argument they gave about the hierarchical nature of the army, about how there is scope for soldiers to revolt, and even where there isn't, it's important for them to take a stand. So So why is the principle of agency only allowed as a defense in, say, civil disputes where agents are allowed to outsource liability to their principals? We think it's because of the information gap that exists in these civil disputes, where the agent does not necessarily know the implications of his actions and is merely acting upon his employee's orders, right? There's absolutely no value judgment to be made in this regard, and even if there was, it is not one that he is capable of making, since he is simply less skilled in that particular field. We think that that distinction simply does not exist between a war general and a soldier in the context of war crimes, because there's absolutely no information asymmetry as to the implications or the consequences of the gruesome, horrific acts that they are committing on the war scene or outside of it, right? Because they both have a basic morality and humanity that allows them to understand the implications of the actions and the complete moral wrongness of their crimes. We think the nature of war crimes is such that they are obviously abhorrently wrong, and there's absolutely no ground for saying that there is no mens rea or no direct intent of the soldiers to commit an act that will have the consequences that it does. But we also would like to point out that soldiers often stand to benefit as a consequence of these crimes that they're committing, right? So if you take the example of ethnic cleansing, we think that does often reinforce the dominance of that very ethnicity of which the soldier is from. If you talk about sexual violence, the rape of innocence is the sexual gratification of that individual soldier himself. So for them to characterize the soldiers as innocent pawns who have no motivation and don't really stand to gain anything and are acting against their interests while committing these crimes is completely false. But coming finally to the hierarchical nature of the army, right? We think it's important to note that there is scope for soldiers to go against the order of their generals, which is not a possibility they have contemplated at all, right? Especially when the orders of their generals go against respecting the basic humanity of individuals and throwing all the rules of war to the wind, right? Because we think that is where there's the most scope for a faction of soldiers and not merely an individual soldier to be opposed to that order. We think in that scenario, soldiers can collectivize and revolt against the upper echelons of the army or the navy or whatever it is when they are strongly principally opposed to the same. We tell you that happened with, say for example, the Navy regiment in Bombay during the Indian independence struggle. But more often than not, it doesn't happen, right? And we can see that. But why doesn't it happen? For two reasons. It could be for one of two reasons. Either because they buy into the idea of ethnic cleansing, of ethnic or superior or sexual superiority over the people that they are subjugating, and to that end should be held mentally culpable because it's not something that they're doing against their beliefs or against their wishes, right? Or secondly, because they know that they can outsource liability of their acts because of this defense that is afforded to them. And for these reasons, we think if you remove this defense, they will necessarily have to be more circumspect when thinking about the implications of these orders and whether it is worth going against them. And to that end, we think this will open up the scope of soldiers actually considering what their role is on a war, on a war scene, and what the potential and the sort of potential they have for redefining what are just acts of war and what are not. But finally, we tell you, even where soldiers have to face grave consequences as a result of their disobedience, we think it is more important to disobey. But before that, I'll take a POI from closing.
The alternative on our side is not to have absolutely no trial, but on pinning further blame on the perpetrator of that crime or the source of that order, because we think that's the power structure we need to deal with, and we see value in that.
But that's exactly what we're dealing with, right? We don't think the sole perpetrator of the crime is the person who gives the orders, because very often the soldiers are complicit because they either agree with the sort of values that that general is holding, because they stand to benefit from the perpetration of these war crimes. And to that end, we think it's simply an obfuscation to say that these soldiers have no idea what they're doing and no idea what the implications of their actions will be. But why do we tell you that even if they will have to face grave consequences, even if they'll be thrown into jail and tortured or killed by the leaders in those armies, it's important for them to disobey? Because of the consistent principled message this upholds, and this message is far more important for humanity to survive and for humanity to recognize that there are simply some principles that are inviolable, right? Because the message we're trying to send out is not that the life of a soldier is less valuable than the life of a victim, but that there are certain absolutely inviolable human rights that can under no circumstances be denied to people. That there are certain acts of torture and sexual violence that are never justifiable. Because when you do pardon soldiers for acting under orders. You are identifying a scenario where the rape and murder of innocents in the most gruesome manner possible is justifiable and does not deserve justice. They spoke to you from side opening opposition about how there's a necessity for closure for the individuals who have been affected by these war crimes. We tell you that never occurs when you're only trying to prosecute the person on top, because that is often a person who has held huge political power, has huge economic power, has huge contacts and ability to hide from, say, the ICC or any prosecuting body. So that trial and investigation will go on for decades, and they will probably die before any justice is actually served. So for them to say that closure occurs when you only prosecute the general is completely false, because closure occurs when the justice that is meted out is commensurate to the level of violence that was inflicted upon those civilians. We think that will only occur when you hold everyone accountable for carrying out these completely abhorrent acts, when they are completely knowledgeable and informed of the implications of their actions. And for all of these reasons, we are very proud to oppose.
Mr. Speaker, when the other side refuses to engage with us on the fact that there is necessarily a hierarchy in war and that soldiers are merely tools of a sovereign where two or more sovereigns are engaged in a state of conflict with each other, is where they're primarily missing out on the biggest part of this debate, right? Because when we necessarily talk to you about hierarchy, we also talk to you about fluidity, right? We also talk to you about the notion that fluidity not only applies to hierarchy, but also applies to mitigating factor. The entire case seems to be based upon the fact, somewhere there is a general, somewhere there is someone on top, and that the individuals giving these orders are the ones who will only be punished. That is or not be punished at all. That is simply not true, right? Depending on the level of individuals who were given orders and who was given the order to perform the actual act on the ground, this notion of hierarchy, the notion of fluidity can be applied in varying circumstances. Like, for example, how I choose to treat a soldier when he's on the ground torturing that person with a burnt out cigarette, and how I treat the general who commands him to get the information out of him because that is necessary for a state of survival, is something that the court which conducts this war trial will necessarily be able to decide. That's how the Nuremberg trials happened. There were expert witnesses. There were witnesses who were tortured. There were people and there were like generals who gave us the order, and there is like enough information available on both the sides of the house. The same information asymmetry that is non-existent, like that they claim about, is also applicable even within the trial. Like, people know what happened and why it happened in the first place. Therefore, the level of this mitigation is not something that's going to let people on top or generals get away. The reason that is not going to happen is because when soldiers are under a trial, it is necessarily going to be a situation where they will be aware of what is happening to them and why they are going pushed under the bus for someone on top who's trying to get away from what is happening, and they will testify against the people who are in power at that given point of time, right? So the nature of trials is not one person just really enforcing things upon the other, but needs to to a larger peaceful goal of justice taking place in the system, something that will not happen on that side of the house, right? Now that we've gotten this point of the hierarchy out of the way, let's look at some of the other things that I want to talk to you about, right? They come here and talk to you about like rape, torture, and why that's different from just normally killing people. Soldiers are given orders to decimate populations around them so that the war can succeed at a proper level. Like, that's blitzkrieg. That's going in, performing a lot of damage and coming down, burning buildings, raping women, and making sure that nothing is left by. Soldiers at this given point of time are under two states. Firstly, they are under a state of self-defense. They are under a state wherein the very sovereign that exists and the very individual or the entity that has defined their lives is under a state of attack. Therefore, the attributability of guilt that must be ascribed to them necessarily must be different in the so-called just forum of a war trial, right? The reason this needs to be different is because they are soldiers who are fighting for their very existence and their country and their family and the women and children back home. Sit down, right? Is necessarily a situation which is not going to be beneficial and therefore cannot be gauged like someone committing a murder outside like NALSAR, right? It's very, very different. And the second thing that's really, really important is they are merely tools. When they rape and torture women, they are carrying out the further goal of a sovereign, and there are lots of methods available within war trials as well as winners in a war trial that they can use to extract this revenge out of from a sovereign, right? For example, a winner in a war very frequently is made to pay reparations. They build back buildings that they have destroyed. They make sure that the harm that they've caused to communities is something that they recognize. In fact, there's also a middle ground, like there are truth and reconciliation conventions where people sit down and talk about, or sit down, right, and what's necessarily happened. Things like these are far better alternative measures that cause better things to necessarily take place among individuals as well as the soldiers and closure to the victims than any form of like making sure the soldier who tortured one person goes to jail, right? Which brings me to the third point. That's something that they've clearly not understood. No one is going to get away. this is a mitigating factor, right? If you have to spend 20 years in jail, make you spend 10 years in jail. If you have to spend 5, we'll make you spend 2. If you have to be killed, you will still be held guilty. If you committed a crime, the court is never going to say that you are not guilty. That is not a nature of a mitigating factor. A mitigating factor ensures that the punishment that you get is adequate and proportional to the nature of your crime. And the nature of your crime in this case is very, very different because of war, because of the reasons I've given you above, right? Now, finally, the final points that they came up here were these points about agency, information, as well as how soldiers can necessarily revolt. Sit down, right? When it comes to soldiers revolting, they seem to make it like, you know what? When soldiers will revolt, they'll realize there's going to be like discourse, right? Like within soldiers, they're going to be like, why are we doing what we're doing? Maybe we shouldn't necessarily do this. That does not happen in a war, right? If soldiers revolt, they get lined up against a wall and get shot, right? There's a firing squad, and this is like known as like abandoning your post, right? It's known as like mutiny. It's not allowed in war, and soldiers are not going to do so. Placing a burden upon that poor 18-year-old boy sitting in the corner of a room who's being asked to torture someone and gain information out of them so that they, like his family can be alive tomorrow in a neighboring village, sit down, is not a fair burden to say, you know what, dude, you could have revolted. Soldiers can't revolt, and even if they can revolt, the outcomes that will come out of this revolt are not going to be either beneficial for them or for their sovereign. No soldier is ever going to tell you, me revolting is going to make sure my state wins the war, right? And that is the primary obligation that a soldier takes upon themselves. Before that, I'll take closing.
So, does a soldier need to commit war crimes in order to win the war or to be an effective soldier on the battlefield?
Alright, no, a soldier does not have to do that, but very often he has to do that to be alive. And the reason he has to do that in order to be alive in a war is because he's been given an order to do so, or he will not be alive tomorrow. Therefore, we tell you that that POI gives into the analogy of what really happens in a war, right? It's a state of like, where the very existence of your state and every single thing that you hold important, the very sovereign is under conflict and something that you simply cannot like just make a rational decision about, right? And further, like let's talk about what apart from the implications of the soldier, what is the psyche of the soldier, and what did Rita talk to you about like with regard to the survival of the sovereign, right? When we talk about the survival of the sovereign and the fact that the nature of like war that exists between countries, we recognize certain wrong acts are committed, and it's not the burden upon this side of the house to tell you like why these wrong acts are okay. We completely concede to the fact that rape, torture, and other illegal means of things that are not allowed in the Geneva Conventions are wrong. However, we tell you that people who must be attributable, A, B, the level of attributability that should be given should necessarily be spread out across a hierarchy, because if you don't spread this out, if you don't use it as a mitigating factor, then is where their model actually kick into place, right? People will, like soldiers who committed crimes, will be thrown under the bus with nothing happening, no closure for victims, the rich and powerful people using the contacts that they're speaking about, getting away with it because they could just deny the fact that it ever happened, right? Like it's very, very easy for people to say, hey, you know what, I didn't give that order. And unless there's some documented proof for you to be available to prove that order was given, what's going to happen to the soldier? The soldier is going to be put to death for something he did, because if he didn't, he would be shot. Why would you make someone who would be shot to commit an act when his very country was under attack as equally guilty as the person who ordered this to him, who gave him this order in the first place, right? And the moment you like realize that there is a primary difference in this is when you also start realizing what Hira spoke about the nature of war trials in the first place, right? The notion of justice in these war trials is necessarily diluted. This dilution is something that is so tilted in the favor of the winner that anyways people are standing in war trials are people who've lost a war, right? And because of the fact that they've lost a war, the way they're treated by the people there is very, very adversarial in the first place. This adversarial nature will only be counterbalanced by making sure that the notion or the justice system that is carrying this out is as fair as possible, is one that takes into account as many factors as possible, and especially factors that meant that the person was not in the right state of mind, right? And that's what all the points about mens rea necessarily meant, that when you're in a state of mind where you can't make rational decisions, even in domestic legal systems, courts recognize that you shouldn't be held guilty because there was something wrong. Being said that you would be killed if you committed them. For example, if there was someone walking outside the door and I put a gun to his head and say, shoot the other person, otherwise I will shoot you. If that person pushes me back, that's one thing that the person can do, right? But you can't do that in a war because that's dangerous. But when this person fires that gun and he's supposed to do it, isn't it going to be okay to hold him guilty? It's not going to be okay to hold him guilty because he was not in control of his rational thought, and this happens to a soldier 10 times a day for a couple of years in a war. Please keep the imagery of this soldier in your mind, and keep in mind that this person is not going to be standing trial in a war at crime tribunal. If you understand this and the fact that this soldier will not be able to make a rational choice, you must understand why the punishment that is given to him must necessarily be reasonable, and therefore we beg you to stand on side with the government.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to talk to you about two constructives in my speech. The first is incentivizing soldiers to not make moral questions of orders, and the second is their characterization of soldiers, and I will remake that characterization. But before that, some points of rebuttal. First, They say a soldier is doing this for the goal of furthering his nation, and that your nation has conditioned you to think this way, and therefore that should be a mitigating factor. Isha pointed out to you in a POI that so is the leader, so is the general, and we tell you that that standard is an absurdly diluted standard, because even terrorists believe that what they are doing is for the furtherance of a particular people they hold to be important. That does not mean that the moral decisions they're making are correct, and that doesn't mean we give mitigation to terrorists who commit awful acts, because you still believe that every person, irrespective of the propaganda that surrounds him, still has basic morals and basic understandings of values which he is not allowed to override. In fact, we tell you that what actually happens is not that they have an absence of this moral culpability, but rather that they have this moral culpability, that they actually do think that the other person that they are committing this act against is subhuman, and therefore they are entitled to do this to that other person. We saw this in the case of the Hutus and Tutsis, where all the Hutu warriors actually believed that the Tutsis were the cockroaches, and therefore they believed they were entitled to rape them, they were entitled to kill them in their houses, they were entitled to remove them and throw them off their country. It's not because they lacked moral culpability, it was the presence of that moral culpability in the entire regime from top to bottom which made those war crimes possible, and we believe that that is the actual characterization. Second, they say the tribunal is set up by those who won the war, so it's already skewed against the people who committed the crimes. First, they only gave you the example of the Nuremberg trials there, right? First, in the Nuremberg trials, you still had objective judges from a variety of countries making the decisions, right? The only factor was the tribunal was organized by the Allies because they were the only ones who could. Germany was not going to set up a tribunal to prosecute itself. So that's a flawed argument, right? Also, today, you have a multiple variety of international criminal tribunals which are objective and not set up by victors in wars. For example, you have the ICC, you have the ICTY, which was set up for the war crimes committed in Yugoslavia. You have the International Criminal Tribunal set up in Cambodia by the international community and not by the victors of that war. Further, that is not a reason to create any exception unless you have a justification for that exception, because if you were to take the tenor of that argument, it means we should permit every exception that favors people who committed the war crimes rather than rationally think about that. Closing. Right. So we believe it's important to send a message of what international morality is. We believe that crimes reflect international morality, and we believe that sending the right message that no matter what the personal consequence to you is, there are certain acts you simply cannot commit, is what you would send in a tribunal for war crimes. And that's what we think is the standard, right? Fourth point of rebuttal. They say, look, we're not granting them immunity, we are just mitigating the sentence, right? We don't believe they are any less morally culpable because the war crimes reflect international consensus on international humanity, and we punish people who don't reflect their morality irrespective of what cause it has, of what the cause is that has made them have this skewed morality. So it doesn't matter if soldiers, nations believe that what they are doing is for the national benefit based on propaganda. Like I said, so do terrorists, so do a variety of people. Your job is first to prosecute those people for holding that alternate morality, and second, to then educate those people and to prevent that kind of situation from arising again. We don't believe that that makes an act any less morally culpable, right? Now let's get to our constructives, right? We believe that it's important to send a clear message that soldiers cannot get away with certain acts simply because that they should question the orders passed down to them from their generals, and we believe that having this motion gives them a strong incentive not to do that. We believe that currently, yes, what they say is true to a large extent, that army mechanisms are strong and they're based on not questioning the orders of people above you. But we believe that that leads to horrible consequences in the first place. That's what causes the genocide that takes place. That's what causes the mass rapes to take place, right? We believe that as the international community, we are in a unique position to stop that from happening because we decide what international crimes are. And we believe that holding that position, we should provide an incentive for that order structure to be broken down in certain circumstances where the crime being committed is of such an awful nature that you don't want to incentivize. You want to have any possibility of there being a deterrent of that action happening. And we believe that even if there is a 1% possibility that one person actually stands up and says, no, this is wrong, because he's no longer shielded by that protection, and then 5 other people join him, there is a chance that you may stop this genocide from happening. And we believe that the consequences that have to be balanced here are the possibility of preventing a genocide, the possibility of preventing mass rapes, versus the possibility of a person losing his life. And we believe that any rational moral judgment would require you to prioritize the first. Okay.
So, you know more about what the incentives of making moral
ISIS having to look up a war with a gun to his head?
Yes, because the nature of the moral choice you're talking about is that intrinsic, right? We recognize that war legitimizes certain acts of violence, like killing the person against you, because you believe that that's in your national defense. But we believe that there are certain other kinds of wrongs which are A, not in your national defense, and B, any form of basic morality would tell you is wrong. Raping a woman who does not possess a gun, who is lying there helpless and crying because you've already killed her child, does not further your war cause, and any rational being, no matter in what state they are, whether it's in the midst of war, would know that that person poses no threat to them and therefore would not commit that crime. So we believe that it is completely logical to place this moral burden on them to make this choice in that circumstance, right? Second, let's deal with the characterization of soldiers, right? We don't think soldiers are unthinking machines, especially when it comes to these basic moral judgments. No matter what the conditioning that you have granted to them, no matter how close-minded you make them, we believe that they still have a small capacity. When they operate in that normal society, they are required to make normal moral judgments. Further, freedom of speech enables them to access basic material on human rights. In fact, most armies make it mandatory for them to be given a manual on the Geneva Convention listing down basic crimes against humanity, which means that they are aware of what things they are supposed to do and what they are not supposed to do, which means when an act is committed that violates those basic norms, they can question those acts. And Isha told you that soldiers do in fact do this. The INA revolt by naval officers during India's War of Independence is an example of this, and we want this to be further propagated. We want to incentivize this from happening. Second, we also think that it's not possible for such crimes to be committed without soldiers being complicit and accepting of these morals that cause these crimes. The Nazi crimes that happened was because it wasn't just Hitler who believed that the Jews were below human, but every soldier believed that the Aryan race was superior, and therefore this crime should be propagated. In Yugoslavia, the Serbs believe the same thing. The possibility of these elaborate regimes of war crimes commissions are far too unstable unless multiple layers are complicit, and therefore we don't buy their argument. For all these reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
Right. Can everyone hear me? Mr. Speaker, we think the opening half of this debate misunderstands the context of when this actually happens. Because you understand that these trials are often post-conflict, which means it happens only in their paradigm to be retributive. We think on closing government that shouldn't be the standard with which we use judgment in international law, but instead should be which mitigates the need for these type of laws, which means which creates a better post-conflict society, not in these areas, but ensures that other conflicts don't take place. Therefore, their standard of whether only the soldier is responsible or not is a very limited debate, but doesn't take into consideration the wider repercussions of how later on this actually happens, and that's what we'll do. We tell you that it shields or moves away from discussion of social collective responsibility, because we tell you that you attack Nazism, you attack the symbols, and you say the army was the only person who actively affected this. We think we have to place responsibility on ourselves, because you have to recognize that we were complicit in such a system where we allow these things to happen. On closing government, we think sitting by is tacit consent and something that we should be held responsible for. We think that acts like this obfuscate that discussion and don't allow proper introspection of whether or how we were like what liability we have in these cases. Couple of points of rebuttal. Firstly, I think that opening opposition missed the characterization of what this actually happens. So let's be clear, I don't think that at any point of time soldiers think that raping people are great or like pre-conflict. But what happens incrementally that means that they both aren't liable, but also that we need to have societal context. There are 2 points of characterization that are necessary. Firstly, often these things are done incrementally. The otherization that takes place isn't something that is done right at the beginning where we say they are different from you. The otherization takes place slowly through propaganda over several years and over time, which means the incremental change that happens in the way that we view particular people isn't something that is consciously happening, but it's something that is subliminal, which means that we're all collectively associated in this type of understanding of a different type of people. But secondly, and more problematically, we tell you that in these cases, it's often painted that it's you versus me. The reason the reason that people are able to commit the atrocities that they are able to commit is because they believe that if it wasn't, or that what they're doing, if I didn't do it first, the other person would do it after me. We tell you that this type of discussion of what they want to talk about, of upholding a moral responsibility or moral principle, doesn't functionally work at a time where you have stronger governments, or at that time being able to lapse the army and the general populace into a trance where they make them believe that you are under attack. We said this is exactly what you saw with the Iraq war, right? It's not that the Americans, or at any point, forget the soldiers or the community, actually believe that we should rape women or that we should actively invade and do the things that we actually did. But what we were able to see in these areas is that people were able to tell them that they are going to out to get you, they are going to affect you, and you play on that rhetoric, which is often an echo chamber where you only hear that side of it. We tell you at closing government, why do we want to change this? Because we tell you that often what happens is that post-conflict, when such things have happened and we are the perpetrators or we are the victors, there's a limited amount of shame and limited amount of capital that we want to exploit in these cases. We tell you what happens under opposition's model, where you're able to tell them that this was your fault. We tell you that you only attack and place responsibility to the smoking gun. You don't recognize that you are the person holding that tool. And that means that you never take collective responsibility for things that you that you have contributed towards this type of discussion. We think that means that while the manifestations of these things will change, the amount or the social responsibility and thinking doesn't change, because we never introspect and think to ourselves, why is it that we allowed such things to happen? Why is it that we were complicit in killing all of these people? Why did none of us stand up or dissent in these areas? We think the active moral responsibility or moral consciousness that we want within them is to look deeper into why that actually happens in the case, and not only an attack of Nazism in this case. No, thank you. Sit. So we tell you that that's something that we think is particularly necessary, and this obfuscates that discussion because it's able for you to place that burden on somebody else, to say, I am not responsible, somebody else is responsible. But let's discuss, before I take closing.
Sir, if a soldier kills and rapes 2 women on the battlefield, is he going to be punished the same punishment as the general who ordered a holocaust of 1,000 people?
Right, and this is something that was discussed in the opening half. The distinction is quite clear. Within the soldiers, there's a different type of ideological hegemony that takes place. For at the general level, the hegemony that takes place is that it's me versus you, and where you are attacking these people. So the source of the power is the general, versus soldiers at this point are only the actors or the smoking guns within these places. We tell you that this is problematic because the distinction between a general and a pawn is when we only place Hitler, or we say Hitler isn't, we can still blame Hitler, we can still blame Nazism, but when we're able to blame the common man, the soldiers, the faceless people who we don't see, that means that we sufficiently attach importance to them and say these are the people who did it, not us. And we think that discussion needs to take place. But more than that, we think that you have to base the standards like you do in law about what can you reasonably expect from these people. We tell you what you can reasonably expect from these people is the ability to dissent, and this is something that Isha talks about, the ability to dissent. We tell you this doesn't happen because the type of environment through which this happens, as I've already pointed out to you, is often strongly nationalistic, where if you're considered a national traitor if you do this. But more than that, it's often a crackdown amongst people, right? Where any dissenters or any small pocket of dissent is quickly cramped down upon, which means you're never able to interact with your other soldiers and think about whether or not to collectivize and say, I also think they're doing something wrong. Do you think so as well? Because you recognize, I'll take closing, yeah.
If you want to reduce this us versus them, why not stop prosecuting anyone for war crimes?
Right. Look, that's exactly the distinction that I drew earlier. The point that I'm trying to make is Hitler is still the face of Nazism, and that's still something that we need to deal, because we think that fascism and Nazism and those type of ideologies is particularly bad, and that's still killing the symbol of that. The point that I'm trying to make is that we have to look at what caused Nazism, what allowed Nazism to thrive in these areas. And the only way that we can do that is to introspect and to think about when we are fearful or when we are challenged, how do we respond? Because that type of moral discussion and moral introspection will mean that we're more likely to be able to sustain damage when it's is dressed up in other ways. Because under their side, what do you have? Nobody's going to be able to come up with fascism. But we see in general life, you still have people like the ISIS. You still have lots of Islamic rhetoric within these places because we haven't discussed, and you see lots of foreigners going into the ISIS rhetoric because we haven't been able to discuss amongst ourselves that when we are put under pressure, when we are like under fear, when we feel under attack, what are we possibly capable of? That discussion never takes place because all the attention is driven towards attacking Nazism. We don't think that that will ever have less post-conflict society, something that we think we should aim to do. We're exceptionally proud to propose.
It's already showing the battery. Can you help me?
Isn't she here? Can I get like one of the water? Can I be like, am I audible? Everything fine? Cool. Yeah. Amrit plan. Hello? Audible? No. Ah, okay. I'm not used to this. I'm not used to final stages. Okay. Anyway. Mr. Speaker, we think it's deplorable for government to come out here and try and build a case for both benches, by the way, that somehow ideas have become more culpable than people. And doing this move means that we no longer can attack the idea of Nazism. I'm sorry, but I don't think I need to create a mitigating factor for Nazi soldiers in order to tell everybody that Nazism is bad. I'm sorry, I don't need to make sure that people can get away with arguing that a general was responsible and pin the blame on one individual just so that I can then later have a discussion about whether or not that general was actually bad or legitimately bad or neo-Nazism is legit or what is legit. We know war crimes are bad things because of the fact that everybody on this planet has agreed that no matter what you are doing and why you are doing it, certain things can never be done to human beings. So you can't launch chemical weapons on people, you can't utilize brutal rape as a method of oppression, and you can't utilize genocide as a means of proving your superiority. Which means that if people believe that on that basis it's justified for them to go ahead and commit the crimes, then we tell you that irrespective of attention and for the greater principle of telling future horrible people there are certain especially horrible things you cannot do, for that purpose, for achieving that minimum basis, we support an absolute liability. First, some housekeeping. We think that the characterization that they provided us is as if this dude constantly, when he's launching a missile or committing genocide or for example committing brutal rape like on a woman, has that gun pointed to his head. We don't understand how this binary exists where he's either going to be killed or he's killing. Like, we don't understand it because guess what? He's in a position, he's got the equipment, and he's the victor at that moment when he's committing that war crime. Which means he's got that gun, and he's not got a gun against his head, the gun's in his hand, and he's got an order which makes him, allows him gives him a free pass to commit violence against another human being. So we hate that characterization, that actions are so ridiculously momentarily categorized. A war crime takes a lot of people and a lot of effort to do. We tell you that doing bad things requires a lot of institutionalization and a lot of management, right? Like you got to make sure all your soldiers have all the guns and all your soldiers are raping, which means that all of those soldiers together collectively at each instance decide to commit those war crimes individually because they continue to do it through a series of actions. Stop strawmanning how bad and how long a war crime goes on for. But more importantly, we tell you that, listen, okay, here's the problem that we have with this entire argument about the fact that, we need to build post-colonial societies. We tell you that you do need to feel the collective guilt, and you murky this by virtue of allowing the people that committed it to argue that yes, perhaps there were ways in which we can prove how we don't deserve to have that collective guilt upon yourself. We think that Holocaust denial indicates this, that there were factions within Germany that argued that only particular individuals were responsible and not the entire organization. Those same individuals continue to believe in neo-Nazism, and that's what we think the bigger problem is. That the moment you murky the discussion when something bad has happened, we think that ruins the purpose of proving that something bad has happened. Which is why we think that all of this argumentation that has had about the fact that war tribunals are constituted by the victor and the victor will always screw with them. A, they have the media to do that, so they're going to be doing it anyway. B, war tribunals are basically follow laws and stuff and procedures and things, and we tell you that if it's that bad, then they're not going to care about the mitigating factor anyway, because of the fact they're oh, you have mitigating factor, but we hate you, so screw your mitigating factor. And we think that that's exactly what's going to happen in this debate. First of all, as I've already characterized to you, we think that the means don't justify the ends, and that's why we're perfectly fine with an absolute liability standard. We think that some things are so bad that you need to punish them irrespective of where the liability lies. So in the Bhopal gas tragedy, we punished corporations because of the fact that we felt that what they were doing was just so inherently risky and so inherently bad that it didn't matter what their intention was because they endangered that many people. This is a similar case. You're endangering a lot of people's dignity, so you can't get away by just saying, oh, he's making me endanger them. And that's why we think that absolute liability exists as the standard. But before I move on to the final argument about how institutions don't kill people, people kill people opening.
But the fact that in other parts of society, commanded by the sovereign, is now the reason for mitigating factor.
Then we think it's goddamn convenient that when he was committing the rape, he thought that the rape was justified, but when he's being punished by a war crime tribunal, suddenly he's like, no, the rape wasn't justified, I was just following orders. No, I didn't believe it. I believed it when my penis was inside the woman, but not when he was hanging a knife on top of my head. What does that mean? Only people who will provide the defense of mitigating factors are people who believe that they weren't actually responsible. We're telling you, we don't give a shit because you did bad things that were really, really bad. But let's come to the final argument about the banality of evil. We tell you that war crimes need people and they need a series of continuous actions. We don't like convenient shields, which increases the chances of you doing things. So if you think that you can get away with no cost by blaming one man, one Hitler, one general, then it's more likely that you're going to actually get the legitimacy and the free pass to enjoy that rape or enjoy that genocide and enjoy being terrible to the other. But more importantly, we think that institutions allow you to supersede personal morality. That we think that you follow rules because they are rules. You ignore the questions of what the rules are doing and you rationalize your own evil acts within those particular rules, those faceless words, those faceless texts that some general created somewhere so that he can enable you to do bad things. You treat yourself as part of a structure and then later try to claim that you were never part of that structure and that structure was forcing you to do something, and we don't quite get that. We think that institutions allow you to rationalize your evil into thinking that perhaps it's justified or it's not that bad or perhaps, I wasn't as culpable as everybody else. But we tell you this changes when we remove this particular move because we give you a rock at the time at which you're committing that hard move. And if you're in a hard place, the cost of doing that particular move is also added, which means that it increases the chances of you actually speaking out, which is why we think OO actually still is relevant in this debate. For all of these reasons, and because Patel is going to make sure that I actually do make sense, we think we win this debate.